injection, and they're looking at you 1 second, and the next moment their head bobs over and they're out. And so we try to make it as easy as possible for someone to die, even though whatever they did was so horrendous that we've decided to kill them. But we do it in a painless manner. Well, the Romans were on the other end of the spectrum. They saw the capital punishment as something to be done publicly in a manner so that anybody seeing what would happen would say to themselves, oh my, I do not want to get on the wrong side of these Romans. So it was done in such a way that it was literally horrifying, so that you would say, I'm going to do whatever they want me to do because I don't want them to do this to me. And that's the approach they took when they killed Jesus. Their goal was to make you suffer so much so that those watching would say, I am never going to get on their bad side. Let's look at Mark chapter 10 and verse 32. Gospel of Mark chapter 10, beginning in verse 32. The second half of that verse begins, and he, being Jesus, took again the 12 and began to tell them what things should happen unto him, saying, verse 33, behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be delivered under the chief priests and under the scribes, and they shall condemn him to death, and shall deliver him to the Gentiles. This would, of course, be the Romans. Now, what should strike us about this is that Jesus is telling them what the Romans are going to do. And he has never had a conversation with the Romans. The first thought should be, so how did he know what's going to happen? When you go into a court of law, you don't know what the outcome's going to be. You know what you wish it will be and what you want it to be and what you're hoping it to be and what you've paid your attorneys to try and help it be. But you don't know what they're going to finally decide. Right. But here's Jesus telling them, we're leaving town. We're going to travel to another city, and I'm going to be tried in a criminal court, and I'm going to be convicted, and they're going to deliver me to the Gentiles. Verse 34, he's talking about what they'll do to the Son of Man. And they shall mock him, and shall scourge him, and shall spit upon him, and shall kill him. Look at the 4 verbs. Mock, scourge, spit upon, kill. None of those things are things that I would want to be done to me. Right. And the 3rd day he shall rise again. Don't forget that all the things that happened to him, he knew exactly what he was walking into. Right. That makes it all the more remarkable. Because if you knew all the things that were going to happen to you, you'd probably bail out. That's why we all say it's a good thing God doesn't show us all the stuff that's going to happen, because we probably make an exit and say, you know what, never mind, I'm out of here. Jesus didn't do that. Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12, verse 50. He says, but I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how am I straitened till it be accomplished? At the end of that sentence, there's not a question mark. The way the King James reads, how am I straitened? makes it sound like a question. He's not asking a question. He's making not just a statement, but an exclamation. That term, straightened, from the Greek word suneko, which means distressed, squeezed, compressed, or pressed in on. I'm not claustrophobic, but I've met people who are claustrophobic.
Me too.
And I know some people who are claustrophobic in this room. And one of my former medical partners is claustrophobic. But something happened, and it turned out to be everything was normal, but he required an MRI. And the first time it was ordered, and he went in and signed in, and he did everything. And next thing he knew, in his own words, when he realized he was conscious of the situation, that he said, "You better get me out of here or I'm going to tear this machine up." And they got him out of there. And he ended up with Valium. He was able to go through the MRI process. But I've had an MRI, and I'm not claustrophobic, but I was lying there, and I'm thinking to myself, boy, if I were claustrophobic, I would not be able to stay here. Well, to feel squeezed, to feel pressed in on. It also means to lie sick of. So to be straightened is not something that you want to be. Picking up with in Mark chapter 10 again, moving to verse 38. Jesus is still talking, and he says, but Jesus said unto them, "Ye know not what ye ask. Can you drink of the cup that I drink of, and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" This baptism that he's referring to is the passion of the Christ. The passion of the Christ. In other words, what he went through. I'm going to share with you some excerpts that were published originally in Arizona Medicine by the Arizona Medical Association, put together by Dr. C. Truman Davis. And he says, of the many aspects of his initial suffering, the one which is of particular physiological interest is the bloody sweat. Interestingly enough, the physician, Luke, is the only apostle to mention this occurrence. He says, and this is in Luke 22:44, and being in an agony, he prayed the longer. This was in Gethsemane, of course. And his sweat became as drops of blood trickling down upon the ground. Some people would say, well, you can't sweat blood. Well, actually you can. But the only ones that have ever done this have been those who were under such extreme stress that a physiological occurrence, which is quite rare, but it does occur, it's called hematidrosis. Hematidrsis. And hema is the term we use for blood. If you have a blood disease, you see a hematologist. When we want to see if you are anemic or not, we check your blood and we call it hemoglobin and hematocrit. So hema is the prefix that means blood. Hematidrosis means blood in your sweat. It is well documented. Under great emotional stress, tiny capillaries in the sweat glands can break. Capillaries are the tiniest blood vessels that feed the actual cells and deliver oxygen. But if those capillaries break near your sweat glands, then blood gets in your sweat. This process alone could have produced marked weakness and possible shock. Remember, in Gethsemane, Jesus said, "Come and pray with me for an hour." Well, they fell asleep while he prayed. And when you read his prayer, he was anticipating what was about to happen. What he had described to them before they left to go to Jerusalem is now about to begin. And he was a man. Yes, he was God, but he was a man. And as a human being, you wouldn't be looking forward to that kind of suffering.
Right.
And so in anticipating this, even God in flesh said, "If it be possible, let this cup pass from me." If you knew that you had to go through something really, really awful, excruciatingly painful, as a human being, something in you would say, "I know I've got to do this, but is there any way out? Is there any way to accomplish the goal without having to do this?" Okay, there's no other way, so all right, let's go.
Right.
Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. Although Jesus' betrayal and arrest are important portions of the Passion story, the next event in the account, which is significant from a medical perspective, is his trial before the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas, the high priest. Here, the first physical trauma was inflicted. A soldier struck Jesus across the face for remaining silent when questioned by Caiaphas. The palace guards then blindfolded him, mockingly taunted him to identify them as each passed by, spat on him, and struck him in the face. Now, Roman soldiers, when they struck him in the face, this wasn't some little slap in the cheek. This was a cold cocked fist that is the kind of thing that takes teeth out. They meant to make him suffer as much as possible. Have you ever been punched in the face? It's not a pleasant experience. In the early morning, battered and bruised, dehydrated, and worn out from a sleepless night. Let me just pause for a second. When's the last time that you got up on a morning, stayed up all day, and then stayed up all night, never sleeping, 24 hours in a row? How did you feel at the end of that 24 hours? Well, as a student and resident, there were many times when I would get up on a given day, be up all day, stay up all night, and then be up all day the next day, never seeing a pillow. That led to a lawsuit in the state of New York when a woman in the hospital being treated by a resident who had been up a day, a night, and was in the next day, was half asleep trying to write an order, and whatever he did resulted in her death. Her dad happened to be an attorney, and he sued the state, he sued the hospital, because it was a state-run hospital, he sued everybody. And that led to a change, because he won the lawsuit, and that led to a change in how residents were treated. But it didn't come along in time to save me. So I had many, when we were on the ICU rotation, it's every third night call. So that means every third night you would get up for the day, be up all night, and be up all day the next day, and then go home and crash, and then come in and do it all over again. And every third night you were up all night. I know what it's like to have a sleepless night. And I can really identify with that. You talk about being worn out, but nobody was punching me in the face. Jesus was taken across Jerusalem to the praetorium of the fortress Antonia,
the seat of government of the procurator of Judea, Pontius Pilate. We are familiar with Pilate's action in attempting to shift responsibility to Herod Antipas, the tetrarch of Judea. Jesus apparently suffered no physical mistreatment at the hands of Herod and was returned to Pilate. It was then, in response to the outcry of the mob, that Pilate ordered Barabbas released and condemned Jesus to scourging and crucifixion. Preparations for Jesus' scourging were carried out at Caesar's orders. So this wasn't just Pontius Pilate. This came from the emperor. The prisoner was stripped of his clothing and his hands tied to a post above his head. So stripped naked, a round post with ties at the top, so that both hands would be tied like this as they were standing against the post with their backside exposed, the entire back, literally from neck to feet. The Roman legionnaire stepped forward with the flagrum or flagellum in his hand. This was a short whip consisting of several heavy leather thongs with two small balls of lead attached near the ends of each. So a leather thong, several shreds of leather with two metal balls attached to each of the ends of these. So multiple leather balls attached to multiple strands of leather thongs. The heavy whip was brought down with full force again and again across Jesus' shoulders, back, and legs. At first, the weighted thongs cut through the skin only. Then, as the blows continued, they cut deeper into the subcutaneous tissues, producing first an oozing of blood from the capillaries and veins of the skin, and finally, spurting arterial blood from vessels in the underlying muscles. The small balls of lead first produced large, deep bruises that were broken open by subsequent blows. Finally, the skin of the back was hanging in long ribbons, and the entire area was an unrecognizable mass of torn, bleeding tissue. When it was determined by the centurion in charge that the prisoner was near death, the beating was finally stopped. Their goal, again, was to publicly impress everybody, you don't mess with Rome. And if you do, this is what you're going to get. Anybody got anything to say? And obviously, everybody was like, wow. This is how they kept the boot on the neck of every country that they conquered. You talk about intimidation. The half-fainting Jesus was then untied and allowed to slump to the stone pavement that was wet with his own blood. The Roman soldiers saw a great joke in this provincial Jew claiming to be a king. They threw a robe across his shoulders and placed a stick in his hand for a scepter. They still needed a crown to make their travesty complete. Small, flexible branches covered with long thorns. When you and I think of a thorn, we think of a little sticker bush. These were long thorns that were between 1 and 2 inches long, commonly used for kindling fires in the charcoal braziers in the courtyard, were plaited into the shape of a crude crown. The crown was pressed into his scalp, and again there was copious bleeding as the thorns pierced the very vascular tissue. Ever had a scalp wound or something bump against your scalp that caused a cut? That's when we use the phrase, they bled like a stuck pig. Your scalp is very, very vascular. Lots and lots of vessels in your scalp. So a small cut to the scalp will bleed a whole bunch. And so when this crown of thorns was then pounded into his scalp, there was a lot of bleeding. After mocking him and striking him across the face, the soldiers took the stick from his hand and struck him across the head, driving the thorns deeper into his scalp. Finally, they tired of their sadistic sport and tore the robe from his back. The robe had already become adherent to the clots of blood and serum in the wounds, and its removal, just as in the careless removal of a surgical bandage, caused excruciating pain. The wounds again began to bleed. In deference to Jewish custom, the Romans apparently returned his garments. The heavy patibulum of the cross, this was the one beam that would be now used to be the horizontal beam. The cross, unlike often depicted, they didn't carry an X-shaped thing around, they just carried the beam because the vertical part was permanent in the ground already. And so they carried the beam alone that would be used for their hands, that was horizontal. The heavy patibulum was tied across his shoulders. The procession of the condemned Christ, two thieves, and the execution detail of Roman soldiers, headed by a centurion, began its slow journey along the route which we know today as the Via Dolorosa. In spite of Jesus' efforts to walk erect, the weight of the heavy wooden beam, together with the shock produced by copious loss of blood, was too much. I think about this, and I've had blood drawn. I've got my gallon pin from Hawksworth, but I've also drawn a lot of blood, and it's kind of funny. When people have blood drawn, some will say, they want to watch, and it's fascinating, and other people say, I can't look. But what is most interesting is that when blood is drawn, it's taken some of your fluid volume, and it doesn't necessarily take a whole lot of blood to be drawn for someone to feel a little bit out of sorts. But you know who the most likely people to pass out are? Big, husky men. They are the wimpiest when it comes to blood draws. I wish it weren't true, because I'm a guy, I'm not big and husky, but, it's like, dude, it's just the truth. Women typically, they don't pass out. But guys, they're the ones that get cold and clammy. You can see it in their face. You go, okay, you get ready because they're about to go down. Jesus stumbled and fell. The rough wood of the beam gouged into the lacerated skin and muscles of the shoulders. He tried to rise, but human muscles had been pushed beyond their endurance. The centurion, anxious to proceed with the crucifixion, selected a stalwart North African onlooker, Simon of Cyrene, to carry the cross. Jesus followed, still bleeding and sweating the cold, clammy sweat of shock. The 650-yard journey from the fortress Antonia to Golgotha was finally completed. That's a long walk. You can run 100 yards if you're real fast in about 10 seconds, but if you're walking, it's going to take a lot longer than that. Multiply that by 6.5. 6.5 football fields after having been whipped within an inch of your life. No wonder he couldn't carry the beam. The prisoner was again stripped of his clothing. One of my mentors believes that it's the Catholic Church that put that loincloth on the crucifix. It's common understanding that, again, as a deterrent, the prisoner hanging on the cross didn't have a loincloth. Their goal wasn't just to make you suffer, but it was also to humiliate you.
Right.
The crucifixion began. Jesus was offered wine mixed with myrrh, a mild analgesic, pain-relieving mixture. He refused the drink. Simon was ordered to place the patibulum on the ground, and Jesus was quickly thrown backward with his shoulders against the wood. The legionnaire felt for the depression at the front of the wrist. Many people say, the Bible says the nails were in his hands, but it's common understanding that the term hand included the wrist. If it had been nailed into the palm, all the bones of your hand flow vertically. So if you put a nail anywhere in your palm and then suspend your weight by that, it's just going to tear right through. But you have 2 rows of carpal bones in the wrist. And so the nail, and when we say a nail, we're not talking about something that Pastor is using to drive into the wood over here. We're talking about railroad spikes. These weren't nails that we use in construction. These were railroad spikes that were driven through the midst of these 8 carpal bones. And that would be enough to suspend the weight of a human being. The legionnaire felt for the depression at the front of the wrist. He drove a heavy, square wrought iron nail through the wrist and deep into the wood. Quickly, he moved to the other side and repeated the action, being careful not to pull the arms too tightly, but to allow some flexion and movement. The patibulum was then lifted into place at the top of the stipes. That's the permanent vertical portion. And the titulus, reading, quote, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, end quote, was nailed into place. Why would they put that up there? Again, mockery. Here's this king, and he's naked, bleeding, dying in front of everybody. And it was also a mockery to the Jews, because the Jews are the ones that handed him over, but the Romans and Jews weren't friends. The Jews hated the Romans, and the Romans considered the Jews way less than. So this wasn't like a friendly conspiratorial group. It was just a necessary evil for all of them. The left foot was pressed backward against the right foot. With both feet extended, toes down, a nail was driven through the arch, leaving the knees moderately flexed. The victim was now crucified. The whole idea, again, was to invoke as much suffering as possible. So a crucified victim has a nail driven through their feet, and they can push up on that nail in order to breathe. But eventually, they get tired, and as they slump down, the position and hanging causes them to have trouble breathing. So then you push down on the nail again and straighten your legs to breathe until your muscles again become fatigued and you slump down. And you spend hours moving a few inches up and down, trying to catch your breath. As Jesus slowly sagged down with more weight on the nails in the wrists, excruciating, fiery pain shot along the fingers and up the arms to explode in the brain. The nails in the wrists were putting pressure on the median nerve. Ever bumped your elbow and felt a shooting pain down your arm into your fingers? That nerve is called the radius, or the ulnar nerve. And The reason you feel it is because at the surface in your elbow, that nerve is right near the skin. That supplies the half of your forearm that includes your pinky and half of your fourth finger, your ring finger. Half of that. And the fingertip. If you bang it, you feel electricity shoot down your arm. The median nerve covers all the rest. So the rest of your hand, other than your pinky and half of the ring finger, everything else of the fingers and hand is the median nerve, which runs right through the middle of the wrist. So that railroad spike that was driven through the wrist pierced through the median nerve. As he pushed himself upward to avoid this stretching torment, he placed his full weight on the nail through his feet. Again, there was searing agony as the nail tore through the nerves between the metatarsal bones of his feet. So there's nowhere to hide. Whichever position you are experiencing unreal pain. Just think of whatever, when you've banged your elbow and that shooting electricity goes through your arm, just imagine that lasting not for seconds, but for hours without stop. No wonder he sweat great drops of blood, because he knew what was going to happen. At this point, another phenomenon occurred. As the arms fatigued, great waves of cramps swept over the muscles, knotting them in deep, relentless, throbbing pain. With these cramps came the inability to push himself upward. Hanging by the arm, the pectoral or chest muscles were paralyzed, and the intercostal muscles, the small muscles between the ribs, were unable to act. Air could be drawn into the lungs, but could not be exhaled. Jesus fought to raise himself in order to get even one short breath. Finally, the carbon dioxide level increased in the lungs and in the bloodstream, and the cramps partially subsided. Spasmodically, he was able to push himself upward to exhale and bring in life-giving oxygen. It was undoubtedly during these periods that he uttered the 7 short sentences that are recorded. The first, looking down at the Roman soldiers throwing dice for his garment, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do."
Right.
The second, to the penitent thief, "Today thou shalt be with me in paradise." The third, looking down at Mary, his mother, he said, "Woman, behold your son." Then turning to the terrified, grief-stricken John, the beloved apostle, he said, "Behold your mother." The fourth cry is from the beginning of Psalm chapter 22. my God, why have you forsaken me?" He suffered hours of limitless pain, cycles of twisting, joint-rending cramps, intermittent partial asphyxiation, that's suffocation, and searing pain as tissue was torn from his lacerated back from his movement up and down against the rough timbers of the cross. Then another agony began, a deep crushing pain in the chest as the pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart, slowly filled with serum and began to compress the heart. The prophecy in Psalm 22:14 was being fulfilled. "I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels." End quote. The end was rapidly approaching. The loss of tissue fluids had reached a critical level. The compressed heart was struggling to pump heavy, thick, sluggish blood to the tissues, and the tortured lungs were making a frantic effort to inhale small gulps of air. The markedly dehydrated tissues sent their flood of stimuli to the brain. Jesus gasped his fifth cry, I thirst. Again, we read in the prophetic psalm, my strength is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue cleaveth to my jaws, and thou hast brought me into the dust of death. Psalm 22:15. A sponge soaked in pasca, the cheap sour wine that was the staple drink of the Roman legionnaires, was lifted to Jesus' lips. His body was now in extremis, and he could feel the chill of death creeping through his tissues. This realization brought forth his sixth word, possibly little more than a tortured whisper. It is finished. His mission of atonement had been completed. Finally, he could allow his body to die. With one last surge of strength, he once again pressed his torn feet against the nail, straightened his legs, took a deeper breath, and uttered his seventh and last cry. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Back in 2004, a film that had been privately funded was released, became a blockbuster. The title was Passion of the Christ. When every film is going to be released, there is a particular board that determines what its rating will be. Shortly before it's released, they finally decided on the final rating because they were toying with the idea of giving it the rating NC-17. Even those who don't necessarily know the Lord, in deciding after viewing this film which depicted the Passion of the Christ in as real a manner, straight out of the Scriptures, they almost said, this is so violent that we are going to give it, in effect, an X rating. His death basically was X-rated. Think about that. When you read the Scriptures, we can read it, and it's just words. But when you take the words and put it on film, it's X-rated.
Right.
That's what happened to him. They finally gave it an R rating. Otherwise, people wouldn't have been able to go see it. The point is, he knew what was coming. But he said, nevertheless, not my will, but thine. And he did it for us. The common method of ending a crucifixion was by crurifracture, the breaking of the bones of the legs. This prevented the victim from pushing himself upward. The tension could not be relieved from the muscles of the chest, and then rapid suffocation would occur. Make no mistake, this was just as violent as it sounds. They would basically, after a certain period of time, they want to get this thing over with. They've been suffering now for hours. They would take a big club and walk over and basically swing that club and bash against the legs until you heard a lot of crunching. And your leg bones are the sturdiest bones in your body because they have to carry your weight. So if you've ever experienced a broken bone of any sort, you know how painful that is. Imagine a club up against the bones of your legs until you can no longer use your legs because they want you to be dead and get this over with. The legs of the two thieves were broken, but when the soldiers approached Jesus, they saw that this was unnecessary. Apparently, to make doubly sure of death, the legionnaire drove his lance between the ribs, upward through the pericardium and into the heart. John 19:34 states, "And immediately there came out blood and water." Thus there was an escape of watery fluid from the sac surrounding the heart, that's the pericardium, and the blood of the interior of the heart, that's in the chamber. This is rather conclusive post-mortem evidence that Jesus died, not the usual crucifixion death by suffocation, but of heart failure due to shock and constriction of the heart by fluid in the pericardium. Isaiah wrote, "Who hath believed our report? And to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed." This Friday is Good Friday. It commemorates the day when these events took place, leading up to Easter, the resurrection. I would encourage you this year, don't let it be just about the Easter bunny. I have nothing against candy and Easter bunnies, but we're not children. Let this season do for you what it should do for those who are followers of Christ. Remember, he loves you. And you say, how much does he love me? He loves you this much. Enough to hang on a cross. It might be an egocentric thought, but I think it's true. I've heard it said, and I believe this is factual. Because Jesus said in his description, a parable about the lost sheep, says the shepherd left the 99 to go after one. And I believe that if I was the only one who needed salvation, he would have done it just for one person.
Right.
The point is, he did it for all of us because we all need salvation. So let this Easter season remind you of the gift. It's a gift, but it didn't come free. It's free to you and me, but there was a heavy price paid. You were bought with a price. That's why we can say we don't own ourselves. You've been bought and paid for with a whole lot of suffering. Don't let it be in vain. God bless you.